Hey, welcome. And before we start, let me just explain that you are in a webinar, which means that you can see us, but we cannot see and hear you. Still, you will be able to ask questions and discuss the talk with us in English or in Swedish by writing your question in the Q&A window. And in case you have any technical problems, write a message in the chat window and our technical support, Crystal Olsen, will help you out. With this said, välkomna till Media Impact. Welcome to Media Impact, a series of talks about how media have an impact on communication in art, news, social media, and everyday life. My name is Beate Schirmacher, and it's my pleasure to introduce the talk of Péter Makai. Péter Makai has explored world building in literature and in games. He has published on the fantastic world of J.R.R. Tolkien, but today he will talk about science in video games. In recent years, there has been much talk about gamification, that is using game mechanics for other means than entertainment, for example, in business or in education. But what happens when the rules of the game and the facts you want to bring across meet? During the past years, Péter has looked closer into the role of science in video games, and today he will talk about how games make evolution playable in virtually alive. Welcome, Péter. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, and I'm always excited to share some results that I have been able to coin together. So I hope that my screen now is visible, and hopefully we can get along just fine. So without further ado, we all think of life as something that is metaphorically called a game, but for many, life is anything but a game. It feels tedious, repetitive, full of conflict and suffering. So we seek meaning for why we are here. All meaning and lived experience is created in brains, mediated by bodies and sustained by biological life. Evolution by natural selection is the single most coherent framework explaining the diversity of life on Earth, including ours. Even so, there have been numerous misconceptions about the basic facts of evolution, which suggests that our minds struggle to comprehend our own condition. Is there all there is to it, we seem to be asking? I am Makai Kristóf, and at Linnaeus University, I researched how video games give meaning to the conflicts of biology and human evolution by looking at the process of adapting scientific knowledge into digital games. Many people seem to think that video games are pointlessly and needlessly violent, but they see its power to entertain and they wish to use it to educate and to make players better people. So what I want to show you is how these games address two of the big questions of our existence as seen through the eyes of evolution. What is our place in the web of life, and what do we keep fighting for? The games I study are called God games because you, the player, is placed in the position of power over the whole of the game world. You can influence the weather and make divine miracles, and your mission is to create strange new life and new civilizations. A God game is a strategy game in that you have to manage the scarce resources of your empire and to make sure that strategic decisions about the future of your tribe or species can create something that lasts the test of time. For example, in the game of Spore, you guide your species from a single-celled existence to becoming a spacefaring civilization by evolving your creature and making allies and killing other organisms. Or, in the game Niche, you control a tribe of fantastic creatures called nichelings, which you have no comparison to any other living being on Earth right now, but still, you recognize them as mammals. And you control this tribe of fantastic creatures to hunt for food, to escape predators, to mate, and to influence how nichelings evolve by selecting genes that you want to keep. Needless to say, this is not how evolution actually occurs. In actual evolution, there is no omnipotent being that controls which traits are selected in organisms. It is the job, so to speak, of individual organisms or interaction between the organisms or between groups of organisms to do the selection itself, right? That's what's called natural selection. But because game designers want to challenge you to learn the mechanics of the game, your ability to influence the species you control has to have an impact on the game world itself. And therein lies the greatest paradox of evolutionary god games. Real-life evolution cannot be controlled, but playful evolution must be directed to make sense to the human player and to teach some principles of evolutionary biology. So how is this meaning constructed? Where does humankind figure into this web of life here? In our biological world, through our ancestry, our snapshot as one great big family is most memorably represented by the phylogenetic tree of life. It's a big branching diagram that shows how each species descended from their ancestors and how they separated to become different species. We call this process speciation. Speciation, of course, takes many forms, and representations of the tree of life are found in every medium. You might have seen them in biology textbooks, or in the television documentary Charles Darwin and the Meaning of Life, or you might have come across the website OneZoom, which shows the relationship between all living beings, or read Richard Dawkins' The Ancestor's Tale, or Stephen Baxter's Evolution, which is a science fiction novel. And computer games are no different. Recall, I earlier talked about how god games are strategy games, because you manage your tribe's resources and make strategic decisions. In strategy games, when you do not use resources for immediate production, you may decide to invest these resources into research and therefore develop new abilities or new technologies that will aid you on your quest to become the best and the biggest civilization on that simulated Earth. These new abilities are usually handpicked by the designers and arranged in a diagram, which asks players to make a decision about which technology they want to have first. This is called a technology tree, therefore, because it is branching and it spreads as time goes on, giving more and more decision points to the players. Technology trees and the phylogenetic tree of life are visually represented to be very similar. And instead of researching things like rockets, the wheel, or nuclear fission, as you can see here, evolutionary god games actually allow you to research species and new abilities for these species this way. Take a look at the computer game Birthday's the Beginning. In the game, you can only indirectly influence the game world by raising and lowering the terrain and creating different climate regions. And the game will algorithmically populate it with different species according to rules of their own. As you change the terrain, all creatures will have to adapt the new conditions of existence or face the possibility of going extinct. For example, you can see here that we have ancient human beings on the scene. They do have separate criteria for existence that are defined by how humid or how hot a particular tile is. So you have to create the adequate conditions for their existence. But it's not only for human beings to occur on the scene. You also have to create the conditions of existence for every other ancestor species here. So, for example, you have to create the conditions of existence for Homo erectus, Dryopithecus, earlier primates, and rodents before you can actually see human beings appear in the game world. Taking an analytical view, the game is a playful simulation of what is known in biology as niche construction. By shaping the land, you create habitats for certain species. Another feather in the game's cap is that it focuses on simulating animal populations rather than individual animals. If you look at games like this, of course, you will be able to see that some games actually only focus on individual animals. Still, the growth and shrinking of biomass shakes up the previous balance of the ecosystem in the game. And in the black box of the simulation, plant matter, herbivores, and carnivores are wound chain that you must sustain. Take away any cog and the whole ecosystem suffers. Species in the game go extinct regularly, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Still, the game does not simulate many of the effects that we come to think of as evolutionary and biological. So the effects of mating, sexual selection, reproductive isolation, and many other features are just not present in the game because it has to be simple in order to convey a certain kind of meaning about the truth of evolution. Even so, Birthdays arranges many iconic prehistoric and still extant species into a working tree of life that the player can unlock, and therefore explore the interactions between land and life at their leisure. So now, let's turn our attention to the other big question. What is the role of conflict in evolutionary god games? When people hear or use the phrase the struggle for life, they usually mean that the organism that is the strongest or the most violent gets through and to mate and give offspring to the rest of their company. But this is not necessarily the case. Richard Lewontin, a famous biologist, has used the term vulgar Darwinism to refer to this misconception that only the strongest survive rather than the fittest. In a vulgar Darwinist view of evolution, violence is central and necessary for survival, a literal free-for-all death match. I define vulgar Darwinism as a set of misconceptions about how evolution works. Vulgar Darwinism holds that the struggle for life in nature is a vicious, pitched battle in which violence and avoiding violence is the key to survival. Of course, this is part of the deal, but this is not the whole picture. And we call the aggression between animals of the same species, or different species rather, interspecific aggression. Vulgar Darwinism also holds that reproductive success is directly linked to violence against competitors, that is, members of the same species battle for reproductive rights. This is called intraspecific aggression. Also, aggression, in the vulgar conception of the world, beats cooperation hands down. It's either you are the strongest and you beat everybody else, or you do not get to reproduce. Another misconception is that successful reproduction means that all phenotypical features or behaviors of the winning organism are beneficial or adaptive to the organism. And of course, that's not necessarily the case, because a lot of the things that, animals do not necessarily benefit the animal at all. It was just not deleterious enough that they would be harmed by inheriting it. So, to proceed forward, in contrast to vulgar Darwinism, the evolution of cooperation and altruism has been a key theoretical focus of sociobiology and evolutionary game theory in making sense of rising levels of social and organism among living beings, and especially human cooperation. But the same thing holds for animals. Just think about symbiosis. Symbiosis is how different animal species work together so that both of them have a better chance of survival. And this is everywhere in the animal kingdom when you think of it. So let's see how this all plays out in the game Niche. In Niche, you control a niche tribe that doesn't really exist. It's not any human animal that you can think of. They are just created in order to illustrate particular points about how biology works. And of course, they do simulate these animals much more than, for example, Spore does or any other evolution simulator does. Because what they do is that working genetic system in this game with random mutations, dominant and recessive alleles, things that express phenotypically, but they do not necessarily change the whole perception or the appearance of the animal, but they do provide genes for beating other animals. They do have various genes for deleterious parts of the organism. They may also bear genes for different immunities, for example. So when a new nicheling is born with 2 copies of the exact same immunity allele, they suffer a genetic defect which halves their life expectancy. So they urge you as the player to breed out this deleterious allele from the population. And of course, a lot of these genetical examples are also important. And they also have different rival species, and none of them are actually living species, but still, because they are fictional, perhaps, the player can also look more into the fact that these dynamics and how they work together shape the way that you create your tribe. So they don't have to be real animals in order to convey particular principles about biology. So you have foragers, you do have symbiote animals, you do have prey species, and so on and so forth. And they create a living ecosystem, even though these are not real species necessarily. So you don't have to really worry about, like, how they look, and you just have to focus on the principles in order to understand these things. So some of these things, for example, you can evolve your species in order to make sure that they live up to the challenge of the other animals. And this is what is called the Red Queen's dilemma in actual evolutionary biology. So this is a principle that has been extant in biology. But they have adapted and made it into game mechanics that are meaningful for your tribe of species. And you can actually make these people work. So to conclude, even though conflict is still at the heart of the decisions you make in niche, the game retains some key traits of vulgar Darwinism. Although interspecific aggression is unavoidable in the long run, cooperation within and without the circle of nichelings is essential to your survival, and you can stave off aggressive actions for the long run. But still, aggression needs to happen in order for you to survive and to work very well and to make sure that you win the game. Due to random mutation, some phenotypical traits will simply be byproducts of procreation, and therefore you are advised to selectively breed out particular genes. Finally, aggressive behavior is natural to predators, and your nicheling tribe can be played in a hostile fashion, but it is self-defeating for all but the most overpowered tribes. Therefore, it promotes a largely foraging lifestyle for you and your species in the long run. To conclude, in this video, I have compared and contrasted different games to give you an idea of how their design can highlight different approaches to the representation of evolutionary complexity. I wanted to showcase how Birthdays the Beginning shifts your focus from thinking about species as individuals to thinking about them as a system, drawing attention to the game's reinvention of the technological tree as a phylogenetic tree. Then in Niche, we saw that conflict is integral to how we make meaning of evolution, and that the way they challenge the player present biological truths about how species interact. But this is not the whole picture. This is just a brief sketch. I have tried to select a few illustrations that stay relatively close to biological understanding in order to highlight how video games, because they're interactive, can give you a sense of an idea of how actual evolution occurs. Like the various species that you can encounter in evolutionary god games, I invite you all to take an active part in writing a new chapter in the history of understanding of our place in the universe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this talk and this kind of glimpse into evolutionary god games. And yes, it's maybe first when I listen to you now that I realize this is kind of a contradiction. Or what do we end up learning when we play this kinds of play evolution? Is it that we end up believing in God?
Unlikely, I don't think so, not necessarily. I think that the most interesting thing here is that even though you are as a player are an active shaper of that creature's future, because the game works as an algorithm, it also teaches you that, all species must respond to their environment, and therefore they have to respond to these things. So you can also make it as an allegory of, what goes on within the species and the gene pools, and they do not have to necessarily be thoughtful or intelligent in order to respond to the actions of the environment. So it's always a big question of what people get away from this game. Do they really understand that this can only occur as part of divine benevolence? I do not necessarily think so, but because particular medium in which you have to be an active part of the game world's happenings, it's hard to take away that agency and to still feel that this is an important and insightful simulation of evolution.
You just mentioned that this is this kinds of, when you put evolution into video games, then right. You have to have part, you have to take an active part in evolution. I know that in your research that you not only looked into video games, but you looked how evolution is adapted, allow me the pun, into all different kinds of, into novels, into board games, and other kind of media. yeah, could you talk a bit more about that? And
Yeah.
when is evolution most fun? When you read about it, when you play it, when you play a board game?
Evolution is almost never fun, but few things in life are, right? So, and that is, I think that one of the things that are really important to me from a completely different psychological perspective. But focusing on the intermediate aspects of, like, how we convey evolution to a lay public, I think that no one medium can have a dominion over other media as a way of representing, like, this is how evolution is. You can't just say that, here we have a nonfiction book, read this and then you will know what evolution is about. Because evolution is also about, this tug of war between different species and their agencies. And the same thing goes for, you can watch a documentary narrated by Richard Attenborough about what happens when, different species interact. But you will not necessarily have the idea of, like, what goes on behind the scenes. And video games are one part of this portion. Novels also offer, for example, Stephen Baxter's Evolution gives us an insight into, like, what goes on in the minds of the creatures who are evolving, even though that, most of these creatures would not necessarily have the linguistic skills in order to express themselves. But due to the way that we approach a novel, that we will be seeing different kinds of minds and how these minds interact with the world at large, we can, be very charitable about, like, what they're saying occurs in the minds of animals, and still feel like that we're getting some sort of an accurate representation of the dilemmas that comes with survival. So I think that, for example, novels are an integral part of this thing, even though, of course, we know a little bit about how human minds work, but we know next to nothing about how animal minds work. And there's a productive dilemma in these various ways of, making evolution or biology intelligible for us all, because we do not have access to the decision making that goes on in these processes. So we have to make inferences about these things, but still they can be entertaining because we use our imagination in order to make this alive.
Yeah. So what happens when in these video games is that because that was what happened to me when I listened to your talk now, that you grasp something about it. It's about understanding that the complex interrelation of different decisions, and there is incredibly many parameters that you have to keep in mind in case you really want to play it strategically.
Right. I think that one of the great things is that, games allow you to fail. And I think that evolution is a story of failure for the most part. 99% of the species that have ever lived are dead. They're gone. And the rest of us, we're still here for the moment, but we're not necessarily success stories. We're success stories for a moment. So I think that this is one of the big realizations that these games and these novels and nonfiction novels give you, that they give you the sense that, life is always contagious, and that you cannot take it for granted, and that you have to work for it if you want to live the kind of life that you think is worth living. And so there is this ethical component as well, that you are also, as human beings, responsible for the species, that at least you do not necessarily, destroy their habitats as part of your, existence. And I think that this is something that, is covertly there. So, for example, Terry Pratchett talks about stealth philosophy, that, he did not write these novels in order for, his view of the world to be directly transmitted into the people's minds, but he wanted to showcase events and, happenings when, his principles come to shine. And I think the same thing goes for things like algorithms. They do not necessarily directly teach you that this thing is bad and this thing is good, but by the virtue of it playing out in the virtual world, you do get a sense of, like, how this is supposed to go, and you can make your own conclusions.
Yes, I just wanted to say, yeah. Here's a question from the audience, because I was so eager to pose you a question that I didn't invite the audience or reminded you that you can pose your questions in the chat. But what do you think? And that is exactly the my next question. What is the role of gamification in education? And what do people have to keep in mind? What are the dangers or the things that you have to keep in mind if you use it in school? Or are there only good points? Are there only benefits, or are there some things that you have to keep in mind if you want to use gamification in teaching? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that this is something that is on a lot of people's minds, and it is a very interesting topic to. But I have to proceed with two caveats. That I have absolutely no qualifications to talk about gamification because that is not my area of research. And the second thing, that I'm very critical of the things that I've actually seen about gamification research, especially coming from game studies scholars, because they are the most skeptical of the bunch. And is that for a lot of time, especially in the early 2000s, people thought that gamification is that, we make these students competitive and we give them very good feedback, quantified feedback about what they're doing. And so we'll have, things like, different points. We do have leaderboards. We do have different badges. So this has been kind of like a paradigm of like, we really like what video games are doing to motivate the players to keep making that thing going and to keep playing the game. But this does not necessarily work in education, I don't think, because they serve different purposes. Video games are products. They are meant to be consumed. They are meant to be purchased, and they are meant to be spending more and more money off. So they create artificial challenges for the player to overcome. And I don't think that education should be like this. Education should be mutual discovery. Education should be something that is not quantified at all. It should be something that should be, like a free realm for the human spirit to explore. And you cannot really make gamified video game mechanics in order to foster that, I don't think. Of course, perhaps other people who are much more deep into the ideology of gamification might give you different answers. But I would say that, the problem with education has never been that it doesn't, change human beings and it doesn't transform themselves. The problem with education has always been is that, especially in our modern era, we've been thinking about, education as being, something that is a product that you will eventually produce a diploma into a person that they will be able to wave at their future employers. And I don't think that's what education should be about. So I'm very hesitant to think of gamification as a solution to any of the problems, because gamification almost always translates to quantification and surveillance. And I think both of those things are antithetical to both the human spirit and to productivity in the long run.
Yes, that's a lot of points to think about. And you started with saying, I cannot say anything about it because I'm not in gamification. But from what you have seen, how kind of evolution is transformed or adapted or made playable, what are your thoughts on what one should maybe think about or consider in order to, if you want to bring something across with a game, what should you think about?
So one interesting thing is that, we think of the player as being this thing that, the game is for. Mm-hmm. And therefore the player should have as many actions as possible in order to make sure that they can, make interesting decisions and that they get hooked up into the game. But there's another approach that I think that I find very enlightening, is that, you have games which are called idle games, which you do not necessarily have a direct influence over the game world, but you just let the game run over extended periods of time. And, because of the algorithms and the way you tool the system every once in a while, it produces a certain amount of thing. And then you can use that as a factor of time and your decisions to make into something that you have no direct control of. And I think that it's a very interesting thing to put a video game in a place where you have no direct control over what happens. And partially, that's what God games do, because you do not necessarily directly control each and every AI organism. But idle games put this into a whole different perspective. You might be able to choose, I want to go in this direction, and then the game does its thing. for days on end. And I think that's much more truthful to the general idea that you do not necessarily want to have the player to have control over the game world, but to let the simulation run, let the algorithm do its job.
So then it's the thing one can take away, what you really experience in playing these games, is being not in control and experience what happens and see how things play out.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to draw a long shot comparison to, like, how things work out in the world. I think that, the worst political systems that you can actually live in is when the sovereign controls every aspect of your life, right? And when you live in a more democratic state, then you are much more likely to, let, nature take its course. And then you don't have to be, constantly be on your guard so that the supreme being controls every decision that you make. And I think that the same thing should go for a more democratic form of gameplay. You should let AI do their work.
Thank you, Peter. That
Thank you
is
so
the
much.
nice final word. And because our time is up, thank you very much, Peter, for your talk and
Thanks so
thoughts
much.
on video games. I hope that you have enjoyed this talk and our discussion afterwards. And yeah, we will have a break during the summer now, but keep a look out for the next media impact at the end of September, I think. So I hope you will join us then again. Thank you all and goodbye.